Inside Corcoran State Prison, California, where inmates are shot. There is a place in California where control is measured not just in locks and walls, but in seconds. Seconds between a fight breaking out and a rifle being raised. Seconds between a warning and a gunshot. Seconds that decide whether a man walks away or doesn't walk at all. At Corcoran State Prison, violence didn't just happen, it unfolded inside a system that was supposed to prevent it. And yet, for years, something deeply unsettling took place here. Inmates fought. Guards watched. And then, from above, shots were fired. Not during riots. Not during full-scale uprisings. But during controlled, scheduled yard time. That's what made it different. That's what made it dangerous. And that's what raised a question no one could ignore forever. How does a prison, built to maintain order, become a place where violence is not just stopped, but seemingly anticipated? What unfolds inside Corcoran is not just a story about crime or punishment. It's about a system pushed to a point where the line between control and chaos begins to disappear. And once that line is crossed, it's not easy to come back. Corcoran was built in the late 1980s, during a time when California's prison population was growing rapidly. The state needed space. But more importantly, it needed control. Facilities like Corcoran weren't designed for rehabilitation. They were designed to contain individuals considered too dangerous for standard prisons, men with histories of violence, gang leadership, or repeated disciplinary issues. From the beginning, everything about Corcoran reflected that purpose. The architecture is rigid, functional, unforgiving. Long stretches of concrete, multiple layers of fencing. Gun towers positioned with clear, unobstructed views of the yards below. Every angle, calculated. Every movement, observable. Inside, the prison is divided into different units, each with varying levels of security. But even in general population areas, the atmosphere is tense. Because the men housed here are not just serving time. Many are still connected, to gangs, to outside networks, to ongoing conflicts that don't end at the prison gate. And when those conflicts enter a controlled environment, they don't disappear. They evolve. A typical day inside Corcoran begins early. Before sunrise, the prison comes alive, not with energy, but with routine. Metal doors open and close with mechanical precision. Voices echo down narrow corridors. Counts are conducted, again and again, ensuring every inmate is accounted for. Movement is tightly controlled. Inmates don't simply walk from one place to another. They are escorted, often restrained, guided through a system designed to minimize unpredictability. Even small privileges, like showers or yard time, are scheduled down to the minute. On the surface, it appears orderly, structured, controlled. But beneath that routine, there's another system operating quietly. One that isn't written in official policies. One that doesn't appear in reports. A system built on hierarchy, loyalty, and power. Because inside Corcoran, control doesn't belong solely to the guards. It's shared, sometimes unwillingly, with the inmates themselves. Life inside a cell is constant. There is no real separation between day and night, between activity and stillness. Two people share a space no larger than a small room. Every movement is noticed. Every habit is observed. Privacy doesn't exist here. And over time, that lack of space begins to change how people think. How they react. How they survive. Some inmates adapt by forming alliances. Others keep to themselves, avoiding attention as much as possible. But even silence can be misinterpreted. Because in an environment like this, everything carries meaning. A glance. A word. Even the absence of either. And when misunderstandings happen, they don't stay small. The yard is one of the few places where inmates experience something close to freedom. Open space. Movement without walls. A chance to step outside the constant pressure of confinement. But at Corcoran, the yard carries a different kind of tension. Because this is where systems collide. Different groups, often separated inside housing units, are brought together. Different allegiances share the same space. Different conflicts come face to face. And while everything appears controlled, there is always an underlying awareness that something could happen at any moment. Because many of the men on that yard carry histories that don't stay buried. They carry grudges, orders, expectations, and sometimes, unfinished business. What happens when all of that is placed in one open space? What happens when individuals who are not supposed to cross paths suddenly do? At Corcoran, those moments became more than rare incidents. They became patterns. From above, everything looks different. Guards in the towers have a clear, uninterrupted view of the yard below. They can see movements before they escalate. They can identify tensions before they turn into violence. They are positioned not just to observe, but to respond. And when a fight breaks out, the response is immediate. Or at least, it's supposed to be. At Corcoran, that response often involved firearms. Rifles loaded with live ammunition. Aiming downward into a crowd of moving bodies. Firing not just to warn, but to stop. Sometimes that meant striking the ground. Other times, it meant striking a person. And when bullets enter a situation already filled with chaos, the outcome becomes unpredictable. But what began to raise questions wasn't just the use of force. It was the frequency. The repetition. The pattern that seemed too consistent to be coincidence. Why were so many incidents occurring during controlled yard time? Why were certain inmates repeatedly involved in these confrontations? And why did it sometimes feel like the violence wasn't being prevented, but allowed to unfold? Witness accounts and later investigations pointed to something deeply troubling. In some cases, inmates known to be enemies were placed on the yard together, despite clear records indicating they should be separated. These weren't random pairings. They were known conflicts. Documented tensions. Situations that, under normal circumstances, would be avoided. But here, they were brought into the same space. And when those individuals crossed paths, violence followed. Fights would break out quickly, sometimes within seconds. Other inmates would scatter, trying to avoid becoming part of something they didn't start. And from above, guards would react. Shots fired. Commands shouted. Chaos spreading across the yard. Official reports described these actions as necessary. A response to immediate threats. But as more incidents occurred, a different narrative began to form. What if these situations weren't entirely accidental? What if the system itself was creating the conditions for violence? As scrutiny grew, investigations followed. External agencies began looking into the pattern of shootings at Corcoran. Reports were reviewed. Testimonies were collected, from inmates, from staff, from those who had witnessed the events firsthand. And what emerged was not a single incident, but a series of them. Repeated over time. Similar in structure. Consistent in outcome. Some accounts suggested that fights were not always stopped immediately. That intervention was sometimes delayed. That escalation was allowed, before force was used. The reasoning behind it remains debated. Some described it as a breakdown in protocol. Others saw it as something more deliberate. A method of control. A way to send a message, both to inmates and to staff. But regardless of intention, the result was the same. Lives were lost. Trust eroded. And the line between maintaining order and contributing to violence became increasingly difficult to define. When the yard empties and the prison settles into the night, the noise fades, but the tension doesn't disappear. Inside cells, conversations continue in low voices. Some replay the events of the day. Others prepare for what might come next. Because in a place like Corcoran, nothing feels completely resolved. Conflicts don't end. They pause. They shift. They wait. And for many inmates, the uncertainty is part of the punishment. Not knowing when something will happen. Not knowing if they'll be caught in it. Not knowing if the system meant to protect them might also put them at risk. And that uncertainty changes people. It shapes behavior. It alters decisions. It forces individuals to adapt in ways they never expected. But the deeper story of Corcoran doesn't end with the yard. Because what happens behind closed doors, in isolation units, in administrative decisions, in unseen moments, adds another layer to a system already under pressure. And what comes next raises even more difficult questions. Questions about accountability, about responsibility, and about what happens when control begins to look indistinguishable from chaos. By the early 1990s, something at Corcoran had begun to draw attention beyond its walls. Not because violence existed, violence was expected in a maximum security prison. But because of how it unfolded. And how often it ended the same way. Gunfire from above. Bodies on the ground. Reports filed, and then repeated. One of the most troubling patterns involved what became known as gladiator-style fights. It's a phrase that would later appear in testimonies and investigations, not as exaggeration, but as an attempt to describe something that didn't feel accidental. According to multiple accounts, certain inmates, known enemies, were placed on the yard together. These weren't unknown rivalries. They were documented, recognized, avoidable. And yet, they were allowed to meet. Sometimes, they were even encouraged by subtle signals. A look. A word. An understanding that violence was expected. And once it began, everything moved quickly. Fights in prison don't start like they do in movies. There's no dramatic build-up. No clear signal. Just a shift in energy. A moment when everyone nearby senses that something is about to happen. Then it does. Two men move toward each other. Words may be exchanged, but often, there's no conversation at all. Because the outcome has already been decided long before that moment. The first strike is fast. Brutal. And within seconds, the situation escalates. Other inmates step back, not out of fear, but out of understanding. You don't interfere. You don't get involved. Because once it starts, it belongs to those inside it. And to those watching from above. From the towers, guards are trained to respond. But response doesn't always mean immediate action. Sometimes, there's a pause. Seconds where the fight continues. Seconds where the situation intensifies. And then, a command. A warning. Or in some cases, a shot. The sound cuts through everything. Sharp. Immediate. Final. Inmates scatter instinctively, dropping to the ground or running for distance. But not everyone moves in time. And when a bullet finds its target, the scene changes instantly. What was a fight becomes something else entirely. The official justification was always the same. Lethal force was used to stop violence. To protect lives. To maintain order. And in many cases, that explanation aligned with policy. But as the number of shootings increased, questions became harder to ignore. Because these weren't isolated incidents. They followed a pattern. And patterns suggest intention. Why were the same types of confrontations happening repeatedly? Why were certain inmates consistently involved? And why did intervention sometimes come only after the situation had escalated beyond control? For those outside the system, these questions demanded answers. For those inside? They were part of daily life. Some inmates later described the yard as unpredictable, but not random. They spoke of understanding how things worked. Of recognizing when a situation was being set up. Of knowing that certain pairings weren't coincidental. One account described it simply: you could feel it before it happened. Who was out there? Who wasn't supposed to be? That awareness didn't make it safer. It made it heavier. Because it meant that avoiding violence wasn't always possible. Sometimes, being present was enough. And when the system itself becomes part of that equation, there are fewer places left to stand. As reports of these incidents spread, investigations began to take shape. Not internal reviews, but external scrutiny. Federal authorities became involved. Civil rights concerns were raised. And the focus shifted from individual incidents to the system as a whole. One of the central questions was whether excessive force was being used. But another question, more difficult to answer, began to emerge: was force being used in response to violence? Or as part of a process that allowed violence to occur? The distinction matters. Because one suggests reaction. The other suggests participation. Lawsuits followed. Families of inmates who had been shot, or killed, began to seek answers. Legal teams examined records, timelines, and testimonies. Patterns became evidence. Repetition became argument. And the narrative that formed was not simple. It didn't rely on a single event or a single decision. It pointed to something broader. A culture. An environment where certain practices were accepted, even if they were never formally acknowledged. Some guards were accused of facilitating fights. Others of delaying intervention. Not all. But enough to raise serious concern. And as the legal process unfolded, those concerns moved from suspicion to public record. The outcomes of these cases varied. Some resulted in settlements. Others led to disciplinary action. A few brought significant attention to the practices inside Corcoran. But change, when it came, was gradual. Because institutions don't shift overnight. They resist. They adapt slowly. And sometimes, they only change when they are forced to. Policies were reviewed. Use of force guidelines were re-examined. Oversight increased. But the deeper question remained: had the system learned from what happened? Or had it simply adjusted its visibility? Beyond the yard, there is another part of Corcoran that operates under different conditions. The SHU. Security housing units designed for isolation. Here, inmates spend up to 23 hours a day alone. No yard in the traditional sense. No group interaction. Minimal human contact. Just a cell. A schedule. And time that moves differently. For some, the SHU is a response to behavior. For others, it's a way to manage influence, removing individuals seen as leaders or threats from the general population. But isolation carries its own consequences. Mental strain. Disorientation. A slow erosion of routine and identity. And yet, even here, the outside system still reaches in. Because influence doesn't require proximity. It requires connection. And in prisons like Corcoran, those connections are never fully broken. For many inmates, survival isn't just physical. It's psychological. Understanding the environment. Reading situations. Knowing when to act, and when not to. At Corcoran, that understanding becomes essential. Because the risks aren't always visible. They don't always announce themselves. Sometimes, they appear in routine. In schedules. In placements that seem ordinary, until they're not. And once you recognize that pattern, you begin to see the system differently. Not just as a structure of control, but as something more complex. Something that doesn't always behave the way it's supposed to. Today, Corcoran still stands. Still operates. Still houses inmates considered among the most difficult to manage. On the surface, much has changed. Policies are stricter. Oversight is stronger. Incidents like those in the early 1990s are no longer as frequent, or as visible. But the history remains. And history, especially in places like this, doesn't disappear. It lingers. In records. In memory. In the way systems evolve, and sometimes repeat. Because the story of Corcoran isn't just about what happened. It's about what it revealed. About how quickly control can shift. About how systems designed to prevent violence can, under pressure, begin to mirror it. And about how difficult it is to draw a clear line between enforcement and escalation. From a distance, Corcoran looks like any other prison. Contained. Ordered. Still. But inside, the reality has always been more complicated. More human. And more uncertain. Because behind every wall, every policy, every decision, are people. Making choices. Responding to pressure. Operating within a system that doesn't always allow for clear answers. And when those choices carry consequences measured in seconds, the impact doesn't stay confined to the moment. It becomes part of something larger. A story that continues, quietly, persistently, long after the shots have faded. And long after the yard falls silent. In places like Corcoran State Prison, silence can be misleading. From the outside, it suggests control, order, stability. But inside, silence often means something else entirely. It means everything is waiting. Waiting for movement. Waiting for routine. Waiting for the next decision, small or large, that could shift the balance again. Because even after the investigations, the lawsuits, and the policy changes, the core reality of Corcoran never truly disappeared. It adapted. For the guards, the environment remains just as complex. Every shift begins with the same understanding: anything can happen. Training emphasizes control, awareness, and response. But experience teaches something deeper. That not every situation is predictable. That not every decision has a clear outcome. And that the weight of those decisions doesn't disappear when the shift ends. Because in a place where seconds matter, hesitation carries risk. But so does action. For the inmates, time continues, structured, controlled, but never simple. Some adapt. They learn the patterns. They understand the unspoken rules. Others struggle with the uncertainty. With the awareness that even routine can carry risk. Because Corcoran taught a generation of inmates something difficult to forget: that control isn't always consistent. That safety isn't always guaranteed. And that sometimes, the system itself becomes part of the tension they're trying to survive. The yard still exists. Still operates. Still serves as a place where movement replaces confinement, if only for a short time. But the history of what happened there doesn't disappear with policy changes. It stays in memory. In awareness. In the way people carry themselves when they step onto that concrete. Because once a place becomes known for something, it doesn't easily lose that identity. And Corcoran became known for something few prisons ever are. Not just for violence, but for how that violence was handled. What happened at Corcoran forced questions that went beyond one facility. Questions about how prisons operate. About how authority is exercised. About what happens when systems designed for control are pushed to their limits. And perhaps most importantly, who is responsible when those limits are crossed? There are no simple answers. Because institutions are made up of individuals. And individuals operate under pressure, within structures that don't always allow for perfect decisions. But what Corcoran revealed is this: when oversight fades. When patterns go unchallenged. When outcomes become routine instead of questioned. Even systems built for order can begin to drift. Today, the gates still open. The counts still happen. The routines still repeat. From a distance, everything appears the same. But beneath that surface, the story of Corcoran remains. Not as something frozen in the past, but as a reminder. Of how quickly control can shift. Of how fragile the balance really is. And of how important it is to keep asking questions, even when the answers are uncomfortable. Because once a system stops being questioned, it stops being understood. Corcoran is just one prison. One place. One story. But what happened here reflects something larger. A tension between control and consequence. Between authority and accountability. Between what is meant to happen and what actually does. And that tension doesn't stay behind walls. It follows the system wherever it exists. Quietly. Persistently. Unresolved. If you want to go deeper into the world's most extreme prisons and the realities inside them, stay with us.